A Storm at Sea, written by George Capaccio, illustrated by Craig Orback. Nathaniel Benjamin Moss lay on his bunk thinking about home. Maybe his mother was right. Maybe he never should have left Massachusetts to be a cabin boy on a whaling ship. It had been only 3 weeks since the Amanda Pierce had set sail from Gray's Wharf in New Bedford, but already Nathaniel wondered if he had made the right decision. The worst part, Nathaniel thought, wasn't the food, although that was horrible. It wasn't even the way the rest of the crew treated him, calling him a greenie because he had never been to sea before. No, the worst part was how much he missed his family. It didn't help either that the ship was always rolling. It rolled up and over the waves. It creaked and moaned. Feeling sick to his stomach, the boy forced himself to stand up. He still had to light the lamps on deck and then help Mr. Tomby, the cook, with supper. Maybe it won't be so bad, he thought, once we get our first whale. Nathaniel went up on deck. A steady wind was gathering force. The sun had nearly set, and it was turning the ocean orange. Captain Brayshaw was taking his turn at the ship's wheel. Nathaniel liked the captain. He was a stern man from Boston, but he treated the men fairly. Nathaniel thought he was a fitting captain for one of the oldest whaling ships out of New Bedford. After he lit the whale oil lamps along the sides of the ship, Nathaniel headed for the galley to help prepare supper. He could hear Mr. Tomby muttering, his accent getting stronger as he got madder. Mr. Tomby was from Barbados. Nathaniel knew Barbados was an island, but he knew nothing more about it, except that the ship wasn't sailing anywhere near Barbados on its way to the Indian Ocean. He didn't think Mr. Tomby was too happy about that. Nathaniel hoped the cook's longing for home would not make him impatient with Nathaniel himself. In the galley, Nathaniel went to work dishing boiling hot codfish soup into bowls for the captain and officers. He could feel Mr. Tomby's icy eyes on him. Nathaniel knew he had better not spill even a drop of soup, but the sea was getting rougher by the minute. Food was spilling all over the place. Without warning, the galley door flew open. The first mate, a tall, heavy-set man named Mr. Turner, ducked inside and slammed the door shut. Nathaniel dropped the ladle. Hot soup scalded his hand. Mr. Tomby glared at him. "Your job is to serve the food I make," the cook yelled, "not to waste it." "All hands on deck," Mr. Turner shouted. "Even you, cabin boy. There's a gale blowing." The first mate grabbed Nathaniel's arm and led him toward the door. Up on deck, Mr. Turner threw a jacket at Nathaniel. "You and Douglas have first watch tonight. It'll be cold up there. Call out if you see a whale or another ship." Nathaniel made his way across the deck. A frosty wind blocked him at every step. The ship rocked in the mighty waves. Suddenly, what looked like a 20-foot wave rolled over the left side of the deck and smashed into the boy's face. Nathaniel lost his balance and fell. He grabbed the nearest mast and held on for dear life. Nathaniel knew he might have been swept overboard if not for the securely anchored mast in the middle of the ship. "Moss!" a voice roared. "Get on your feet! I need you up here!" Nathaniel raised his head. The main mast soared above him. Halfway up he saw, almost lost in the rigging, the unmistakable face of Mr. Douglas, the ship's blacksmith. As Nathaniel began climbing the mast, Mr. Douglas yelled down, "If we don't get these sails furled in a hurry, the wind will rip them to shreds." Nathaniel climbed faster, stepping carefully so that his feet wouldn't slip. High above the deck, Nathaniel could feel every dip and rise the ship took in the storm. The wind shrieked as it blew across the ropes that held the sails. Nathaniel and Mr. Douglas scrambled up and across the rigging, working as hard and as fast as they could. Nathaniel admired the blacksmith's strength and agility. Mr. Douglas was an old man, but his age didn't prevent him from climbing up the ropes and rolling up the mainsail. The two worked without speaking as they moved smoothly in a kind of dance. After finishing they stood side by side. When all the sails were furled, most of the sailors went back below deck to settle in for the night. The ship's bell struck 8 times. The first watch had begun and would last until midnight. To make sure the voyage was successful, the crew took turns watching for whales around the clock. Tonight was Nathaniel and Mr. Douglas's turn. Side by side, they balanced on a large rope high above the deck and leaned on a furled sail. The wind had died down, but the sea still swelled and the ship rocked end to end. Nathaniel held tight to the sail. He was glad he hadn't eaten supper. As he scanned the horizon for whales, Nathaniel thought back to the clear, bright morning when the ship pulled out of the dock at Gray's Wharf. He would never forget the date, March 3rd, 1834, and the excitement of his leaving. He closed his eyes for a moment. With a jolt, Nathaniel felt Mr. Douglas's weighty hand on his shoulder. "Keep your eyes open, Moss. You're standing watch now. Don't be drifting off." Nathaniel nodded and fixed his gaze again on the sea. The clouds had cleared, and a thin moon shone on the waves. "Douglas! Moss! How goes the watch?" came a shout from below. Nathaniel looked down. There on the deck stood Mr. Turner. "It goes well, sir," the boy shouted in reply. "Aye, well indeed," shouted the blacksmith. "The boy is a good companion, and able-bodied as any man on board. I wouldn't have gotten the mainsail furled without his help." Satisfied with the report, Mr. Turner walked away. Able-bodied as any man on board. Mr. Douglas's words rang in Nathaniel's head. It was high praise, but the cabin boy was eager to believe he had earned it. Nathaniel straightened up. The worst of the storm was over. The sea still swelled, but the moon held tight to the sky. For the first time since he left home, Nathaniel felt like a whaleman.